Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thanks to Adam for his presentation. It'll be pretty clear that there are big overlaps between us. I'm already terrified that I'm going to get the class struggle question now. And if so, I might just run. So if I do, it's not personal, it's structural. So today, I'm asking a critical theory question and giving it a Pittsburgh School answer. I live in the critical theory Marx area, and I am a very casual tourist in the Pittsburgh School answer area, so just there's some context if I say something that seems implausibly bad about Brandom or something. That's why, it's me. So to get to my answer, which is that what mediates capitalism as our space of reasons, I'll say a little bit about what mediation has meant in the Hegelian and Marxist tradition. Then I'll summarize 3 answers to the question in my title, and the 3 answers are labor, commodity form, and money. These answers, in theory, should help us to identify capitalism, give us reasons to criticize it, and help us to understand objects and subjects and their relationship within a totality. And they should maybe help us to interpret Marx's Capital accurately. I don't think these answers do a particularly good job of identifying what capitalism is, and this is why I have my own alternative explanation. Unfortunately, my answer also raises some pretty major difficulties of its own, and if I have time, I'll talk about them at the end. So, what is mediation in this debate? As any of you who have dealt with this stuff will know, this is a word used more often than it's clearly explained. Brian O'Connor identified 4 uses of mediation in Hegel's logic. He argued that mediation could be, 1, these are all rough quotes, the movement from contingency to necessity. 2, what makes knowledge of an object or concept possible. 3, what determines the content of an object or concept. And 4, the historical genesis of an object or concept. You don't need to remember all of that. If we lump the last 3 together, I think we can say that mediation is what makes an object or concept what it is, even though the thing that's doing the mediating is not a feature or quality of the thing that is being explained. So for instance, we can know the concept being, sorry, now I'm just falling into Hegel, we can only know being when it is mediated by the concept of nothing. The concept of being is given some of its content by the concept of nothing. And historically speaking, we find in Parmenides the concepts of being and nothing at the same time. So we have content, history, and so forth. So for the purposes of my argument here, I'll shorthand all of this by saying that mediation is a way of talking about what makes a thing what it is without any metaphysical speculation about essences and substances. I and you are human beings because of a conceptual framework and a historical turn of events, and not because we have human souls. Whether I have a human soul or not is none of your business. As for the Marxist side of things, Richard Gunn once argued that mediation in Marx was a way of overcoming the essence-appearance dualism. The appearance, Gunn argued, is the necessary mediation of the essence. We don't have to break through a veil of appearance in order to get at an essence beneath it. Rather, we can only come to know the essence through the appearance. But each appearance in its turn can give rise to its own appearance. There is no end point in the mediation. Quote, exchange value is the mediation of value and is for its part mediated by the money form. So for Gunn, for Marx, all of this is materialist mediation. Mediation just means, quote, the mode of existence of a thing. Appearances are the mode of existence, quote, of the relation in which the producers of commodities stand. So, critical theorists have inherited Hegel's transcendental and conceptual use of the term mediation, but also Marx's materialist use of the term. This complicates things, but hopefully makes them interesting. So, in an important paper from 2016, Frank Angster discussed how critical theorists have tried to explain the link between crises of capitalism and crises in human subjectivity. He did that by describing the capitalist form of what he calls social mediation. Traditional Marxists understood labor as the key form of social mediation in capitalism, and critical theorists have often found the key form in the commodity. So Lukács argued that subjects and objects in a capitalist society are mediated by the commodity form. Adorno agreed, but gave up on Lukács's idea of a revolutionary working class, and Alfred Sohn-Rethel produced a slightly different theory of social mediation in which the commodity form, in exchange, forms the material basis for subjectivity. Each of them avoided both idealism and traditional Marxist materialism. Society here is not mediated by, quote, the power of thinking, reason, and spirit alone, nor is it mediated by labor. And each of these three aimed to make possible a critique of capitalism. Engster himself offers a different answer to our question, following the work of the new Marx reading with its stress on the importance of money in any understanding of Marx's Capital. For this interpretation, readings of Marx that downplay or ignore the role of money in Marx's theory and in capitalism itself have been rendered obsolete. There is no way to understand Capital, the book, without seeing that the value of a commodity is determined in the process of exchange just as much as in the process of production. So, the commodity form is in some important way secondary to money itself. The commodity's value only appears in the process of exchange, which is a monetary one. Therefore, capitalism should be understood as mediated by money. Our goal is to explain and understand, quote, both labor and the commodity form by means of money. Engster concludes, using Marx's own language, that we, quote, have to think of money itself as a blind and automatic subject. So, Engster offers us a three-part history of the mediation debate. First, traditional Marxists argue that capitalism is mediated by labor. Second, critical theorists argue that capitalism is mediated by the commodity form. And third, Engster follows the new Marx reading to argue that capitalism is mediated by money. So, each of these answers is meant to fulfill a few different purposes. Most obviously, they are intended to identify capitalism in some way. To use the Hegelian framework from earlier, what mediates capitalism gives content to our understanding of capitalism. There's no point claiming that something mediates capitalism and that it also mediated the foreign relations of the Tang dynasty. The mediator should be historically specific. At the same time, though, critical theorists are in the Marxist tradition. The purpose of identifying capitalism is to criticize it. So any mediator must aid in this process. At the most basic level, the mediator in question can't be an unchangeable given. If capitalism is mediated by some physical law, then there isn't much we can do to change it, and we're not offering any critique. So, a traditional Marxist account of labor as the mediator is meant to fulfill both of these purposes. Capitalism is the social system driven by labor power rather than by feudal labor relations. The relations of production in capitalism clash with this mode of production. That clash will or should lead to a revolution. What sets the critical theorists apart is their interest in capitalism as a totality that affects both subjects and objects. That is, from Lukács to Engster, each of these thinkers is concerned with the way that capitalism as an economic system affects subjectivity. So, Sohn-Rethel's concept of real abstraction is meant to show how subjectivity is caused by material conditions, in particular coinage, going back to an earlier presentation from today. Engster aims to tie together economic crises and subjective crises. At least according to this tradition of thought, a full explanation of capitalism must account for capitalist subjectivity as well as structures or the economic base. And finally, Lukács and Engster, at least, were both driven to some degree by a desire to produce an accurate interpretation of Marx's own works. So, some problems with these answers. Broadly speaking, the answers outlined in Engster's work succeed in fulfilling the second and third purposes here. In addition, Sohn-Rethel and Adorno are very good at juggling subjectivity and objectivity, and Engster's work is a convincing and coherent reading of Marx's Capital. But I think they're less compelling in fulfilling the first purpose, identifying capitalism in order to criticize it. So, if our answer is to be the commodity form mediates capitalism, we're faced with the immediate problem that commodity production has existed in some form for millennia, and that there has been wage labor of some kind for just as long. Marx himself, of course, was aware of this and never argued that capitalism existed from the very moment that commodities and wage labor existed. Rather, capitalism is the society in which commodity production is the predominant form of production. This makes the claim less clear-cut, but also much more historically plausible. I find it very plausible indeed, in fact, that a society will be very different if it produces most of its needs and wants as commodities, rather than producing them as feudal dues or gift obligations. But even once we've pointed this out, we still have an answer that doesn't identify capitalism. Exactly how predominant does it have to be? This answer, I think, needs to be supplemented. The same problem exists for the money mediates capitalism claim, except in an even more striking way. It seems true that we can't have capitalism without money. However, it's also true that we can have money without capitalism, and indeed that we did have money without capitalism for a very long time. The argument that money mediates capitalism needs its own version of the predominant form argument here. It isn't money per se that mediates capitalism, but money performing a very specific function within a specific mode of production. In this way, the money answer is uncannily like the labor answer, both of which take a more or less trans-historical constant of human economic activity as the central feature of a very recent economic system, leaving us the task of differentiating our kind of money or our kind of labor from their trans-historical kin. So, neither the commodity form, nor money, nor labor are historically specific enough to identify capitalism, since non-capitalist societies have used all of them. And that lack of historical specificity means they have less critical bite than we would prefer. Can we criticize something that we can only hazily identify? The theories in question are certainly critical, I'm not denying that, and they offer great resources for us to engage in criticism. But again, this can only happen if these answers are supplemented by something else. So, I'm going to try to explain the spritzers. It's not just to tease you that you're here instead of at the bar. My answer is that we should understand capitalism as a mediated by the space of reasons. And I think if we take these previous answers and put them in this context, then those answers start to make more sense. So, as I understand the space of reasons, the theory developed out of broadly epistemological worries. What does it mean to say that we are rational? What does it mean to say that we know something? Sellars' answer, as we've already seen today, was to say that empirical knowledge is rational, not because it has a foundation, not because we have some knowledge of this thing hovering out there in the world, but because empirical knowledge is a self-correcting enterprise which can put any claim in jeopardy, though not all of them at once. The space of reasons is an enterprise in which we are both able to and required to rationally justify our claims. To know something does not require us to have some certain foundation for our claim. Such a foundation is not possible. Instead, knowing is being able to play the game of justification. Robert Brandom has offered a highly developed version of this idea. For him, the meaning of a concept is bound up with the inferences that can be made from it. A concept has meaning, and I can be said to know it, only if you are willing and able to hold me to the necessary inferences of that statement. So the concept Aperol Spritz has meaning only because it involves a web of inferences to other concepts like spritz in general, Aperol, Prosecco, and 20th century hipster aperitif habits. And I can be said to grasp the concept Aperol Spritz only if you can and do require me to accept a wide range of other inferences. If I say, I want an Aperol Spritz, you can assume that I also want booze. True. In these terms, knowledge is a matter of asking for and giving reasons for statements, beliefs, and actions. If you can expect to be asked for reasons, you are in the space of reasons. This makes the theory more than an explanation for the possibility of knowledge. It is also a theory about what it means to be a rational human being. It involves what Kant called spontaneity. A being is not rational if it merely responds to causal stimuli. Rational beings do live in the causal world, and I have no choice. I just will get drunk if I have more than one Aperol Spritz. But we are also involved in conceptual reason-giving activities that are not causal in that way. This leads some philosophers, like McDowell, to distinguish between nature and second nature, while also insisting that nature includes second nature. The rational creature necessarily lives in the space of reasons. It is not a mere conceptual scheme that we can choose to apply or not as the mood takes us. Among critical theorists, the space of reasons is often understood more or less neutrally, as it is by Sellars or Brandom. So, Rainer Forst has a theory of noumenal power, which begins with a, quote, normatively neutral notion of power and for which power just is exercised in the space of reasons. And Jürgen Habermas has analogized the space of reasons to his own concept of the life world as the precondition for rational life that is constantly at risk of being colonized by bureaucratic or economistic practices. So for these guys, the space of reason itself is not open to criticism. It is simply the condition for the possibility of rationality at all. I'm suggesting a different approach. We should not see the space of reasons as neutral, universal, or transhistorical. Rather, we should understand the space of reasons as concrete and historically specific, and therefore open to criticism, even while it is also the second nature that we now unavoidably live with and reproduce through our practices of reason giving. This is where a kind of Marx comes in, with a description of the conceptual conditions for the possibility of experience in capitalist societies. The space of reasons mediates our experience because it just is the form of reason that is identical to our society, as Adorno would have put it. This is how our rationality and our world must be constructed given our experience of it. And just as Brandom in particular has fleshed out Sellars' space of reasons by way of Hegel, so we can flesh out the space of reasons by way of Marx. The opening chapters of Capital can be read as explicating the space of reasons of capitalism. Marx begins with the concept of commodity, which can only be understood if we also understand the concept of exchange, which can only be understood if we understand the concept of value, and so on and so forth. These concepts, all taken together, are the web of inferences and reasons available for the justification of beliefs, practices, and knowledge in capitalism. If you ask me to justify my actions here and now, I will most likely end up using the language of profit, efficiency, solvency, and ultimately economic survival, even if I don't want to use those terms. So instead of seeking one specific X that we can call the mediator of capitalism, we should understand our objects and ourselves as being mediated by an historically specific space of reasons. Some of the key concepts within this web are surely commodities and money and labor power, but they cannot individually properly identify capitalism. Once we understand them as concepts whose content is dependent on their relationship to other concepts, however, we'll be able to see how a specific form of labor is crucial to capitalist societies, how a specific form of money is crucial to capitalism, and how a specific form of commodity and commodification is crucial to capitalism. In place of a monocausal account, I think we're in better shape if we attempt to map the broad, varying conceptual web that makes capitalist experience possible. Sorry, I'll skip a little. Thinking about the question in this way has some clear benefits laid out to the alternatives laid out by Engster, compared to the alternatives laid out by Engster. First of all, it identifies a specific social form rather than some transhistorical element of the world that can't really be open to criticism. Second, it is prima facie a good candidate for edicritical theory that wants to offer an account of a totality and of both subject and object, since part of what the subject of reasons is meant to do in the first place is to explain what it means to be a rational creature. And third, it isn't entirely implausible as a Hegelian reading of Marx, though this absolutely is not a hill that I have any interest in defending, let alone dying on. So, perhaps more interesting than the benefits are two issues and questions that this concept of capitalism raises. From the Marxist side, I think it's pretty clear that I'm open to accusations of idealism. Since Marx and Engels themselves, Marxists have been prominent critics of idealism of any kind. On the other hand, plenty of Marxists and socialists have been idealists in one way or another, but the dominant tradition runs from Engels through Lenin's polemical works by way of official Soviet dogma to the present. My response to this issue is to ask why anyone would be so scared of idealism if we want to call Sellars and Brandom idealists. Their thought is naturalistic, supportive of science, attentive to the social at least as much as to the individual, and perfectly compatible with historical development and revolutionary change. The point of any critique of idealism should be to avoid any recourse to any given at all, and too many Marxist materialists assume instead that what we need to do is choose the correct given, which is not ideas. To my eyes, a more worrying problem comes from the Pittsburgh side. doesn't the idea of an historically specific space of reasons lead us into relativism, skepticism, and irrationalism? Saying things like, we have a space of reasons looks a lot like conceptual scheme dualism. The idea that there is some uninterpreted content out there in the world that could be filtered through our space of reasons, but could be better filtered through an improved or even just different space of reasons. And this approach was put to bed by Donald Davidson, among others, long ago. I don't pretend to have a fully worked out answer to that problem. My general response would be to look back to Hegel and the idea that all of this is meant to be an historical development rather than a universal transhistorical framework. We're not Kantians here in that way. Do we have any right to say that whatever space of reasons human beings have developed so far is final and adequate? To my eyes, at least, it seems far from adequate by its own standards. Using Hegel's terms, as they've been used and interpreted by Brandom and McDowell, among others, we can say that the space of reasons is the realm of freedom. If then we see freedom lacking in the world around us, it's surely fair to wonder if the space of reasons actually exists in this sense, or if there are still turns of the historical wheel to come. Again, a turn to Marx suggests that we're not actually living in the realm of absolute spirit or freedom or Brandom's age of trust. Rather, we're living in something that's not so good. The space of reasons right now is contradictory. It is meant to provide us with freedom, but instead gives us whatever this is. If that can be overcome, then we may achieve a space of reasons that gives us what it promises. But that doesn't mean philosophers right now just have to try harder to interpret the world aright so that we can overcome relativism and skepticism. That would be a social and political task for everyone, and philosophers, like everyone else, will have to fight to change the world before we can expect a coherent account of human rationality. So, conclusion. I'm going to skip the first part of the conclusion and hope I've been clear so far. What concepts should philosophers turn our attention to then? I agree with Engster that money would have to be one of the first things for us to consider if we wanted to map this space of reasons, particularly when our economies are so wrapped up with finance. But what I've been surprised by over the last couple of years is that so few critical theorists or philosophers have recently offered critical accounts of the concept of property, and I think that is where I would begin. Thank you.
I agree with your conclusion. I think property is what to look at. But I do not at all understand what the space of reason does. Like, what's progress? Like, why? You could as well say capitalism is mediated by a historically specific form of social production, economy, human life, anything. Like, the substantive story you have to tell by saying how this, whatever it is historically specific. Like, space of reason in itself doesn't do any work here, I think.
Sure. I think it does. I guess we'll see. And I obviously didn't explain it well. So what the thing that it would add would be to insist that, well, first of all, it breaks down the idea of having a monistic version of what capitalism is. So we should not trace capitalism to money.
Someone's moved their hand on.
Oh, okay.
It's okay. You finish answering.
Let me get this up, and then I'll.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just have to go back and forth.
All right.
It's all right.
All right.
Just
Thanks, Carl.
For us, and then Kevin, I guess Matt online.
So the first thing is critical in that it suggests an argument for why we should not say that labor specifically is the thing that we're going to focus on. So that's the critical work that it's doing. The more constructive work would be that it gives me a way of talking about how the things that we are interested in are connected to each other. That if we say, okay, well, let's talk about property and let's talk about labor, then we need to be able to show how those two things are inferentially connected to each other. That having the concept of property that we have implies and infers another historically specific concept of labor, did I do it the right way around? I hope so, of labor, which in turn implies and so on and so on. So it's the picture of an inferential map that I think is interesting there. And if you want to say at the end, like, well, yeah, can't you just say capitalism is like open curly bracket like list of 5,000 concepts, close curly bracket, and I'm like, yeah, it sure is. But space of reasons is quicker. Thank you, that's a good point.
So then Kevin is next, and then we'll go to Matthew online.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for such a great talk. It's fascinating. Maybe I'm picking up on a question, on Boris's question a little bit, but I'm wondering about, I mean, you talked about the shortcomings of the other three traditional, accounts of what mediates capitalism. And like, for example, the problem with money is that there's different versions of it over time, but it sounds like you're acknowledging also that there's, different conceptual frameworks over time for the space of reasons. And if you're accepting that, then it doesn't seem like you're getting a gain over the shortcoming of, for example, money. So that's one question: is how does the space of reasons help you in that respect? And then the other question is about, it seems to me that we live under capitalism. Let's say capitalism has its own space of reasons, you have to do things in a certain way in order to get by. Capital itself, as a work from Marx, is already like a further development that's supposed to expose what is incoherent about what I would think of as the space of reason under capitalism. But I think in your account you're suggesting that Marx just is saying what the space of reasons is. I don't know if I'm making that point clear, but there seems to be a difference there.
Sorry, could we clarify the second one?
The second, yeah, sure. So you turn to spell out what you mean by the space of reasons under capitalism. You turn to Marx, to Capital. These are all the concepts we need to unpack it. But when I think about the space of reasons in the Pittsburgh sense, it's an account of how we keep track of what we owe one another rationally, and it's one that it makes sense of, or is supposed to make sense of, a coherent way of life. So I take it that's what a space of reasons is always doing, and a capitalist one would be an attempt to make sense of capitalism in a justificatory sense, as if we're supposed to live this way, and Marx is doing the opposite of that, getting beyond it.
Yeah, no, that I totally agree with, and my apologies for moving through everything far too quickly. Yes, so I mean, the suppressed stuff in here is that I didn't go into a long thing about Hegel. And so the reason, the way that I get to the Pittsburgh School stuff biographically and also intellectually is through them on Hegel. And so, as many of you will know, like, there's a lot of work that's been done on comparing the way that Marx works in Capital with the way that Hegel does things in logic, in the logic. And that's how I'm getting to the idea of, well, can we read at least the start of Capital as this kind of like conceptual mapping? And so I just agree that, yes, I would not want it to be justificatory in that way. And the way that I would want to avoid that is by saying it's precisely the fact that it doesn't work that alerts us to the failures. So it's like you go through the process. I mean, this is all very... The way that I read Capital, basically, is Marx saying, here is the best possible version of capitalism. Here is how you would justify it. If you really wanted to justify it, it doesn't work. And so that's the kind of project that I have in mind, rather than saying, like, well, here is how it works. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The first question, again, similar answer, is that what I'm suggesting, the picture of history that I'm suggesting, is more Hegel than it is like Kuhn. So rather than like, or Foucault, or whichever one of these people you want to take, so less like, here's the space of reasons of the Middle Ages, here's the space of reasons of like the axial age, here's the space like that, and it would be more like, over a very long time period, we're developing towards something that looks like this realm in which we can actually hold each other to account. And the difference is that people like Brandon want to say we're either at the end or real close to the end, and people like Marx, and not that I'm putting myself in the category, but like people on the other side want to say, no, we're not that close at all. So then it would be less like one after the other and more a development over time, and we're not there, we've never been there. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does, thank you.
Sorry, that got real abstract at the end. Can I?
So you're going to go to
No.
unmute Matthew? Or- Yeah. But then,
Yeah.
Hello there.
yeah. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the talk. I thought that was really fascinating and really interesting. And I just had a quick question about the sort of standards of evidence that you're operating with when you're comparing your view against these other views, right? So you were kind of like, well, look, you know, these sort of commodity-based views where you've got to tell a specific story about the particular kind of commodity that comes up now. And these labor-based views, well, of course there was labor in the past, and you know, the same for money, right? So you've got to tell something specific about these things in our current epoch, right? And I wonder if you could just put that same charge to yourself, right? You've got to give us something which tells us, this is what the space of reasons under capitalism looks like. And I wonder if any resources that you appeal to here could also be used in defense of these other positions as well, and sort of vice versa. So I wonder if, you know, this objection doesn't really tell in favor of your view, and more, you know, whether it's just a sort of worry that all of these views have.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I think this was part of Kevin's question before as well. I guess one way of answering it is to say that what I've done up to this point at least is programmatic rather than substantial. So that I think it's accurate to say, well, haven't human beings been thinking for a really long time as well, Justin? Yeah, I think we have. We've been thinking for a long, long time. So, well, then what's going on here? But then the only answer to that would be, well, if you can succeed in the project of mapping the space of, or this specific space of reasons in some way, if I can succeed in mapping that project in a way of, not me, because I can't do it, I'm not that good, of mapping these concepts and their interrelations, then that will be the proof, if you like. And that's, I don't know if that sounds like a cop-out, but I think the difference is that you can say, if you say, well, what identifies capitalism is the commodity form, then you can write your commodity chapter, and then you're done. And if you say, well, what identifies capitalism is this giant web of concepts that we will have to investigate at great length, then I can't write that chapter, which I think is a weakness to be for sure. In that, is this answer just too complex to be meaningful in any way? And maybe it is. Did that make sense, Matthew?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I suppose the thought would be something like, well, you said, well, if we don't have a precise enough definition of capitalism under these other accounts, that's going to undermine our ability to critique capitalism. And so I wonder if part of the defense of your position is going to have to be like, well, look, nevertheless, we still have critical tools that we can even have this very programmatic vision of the space of reasons under capital.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And this is my nightmare of the class war question now, which is like, so should we wait for you? Let's wait until we've really adequately mapped capitalism until we do anything else. That sounds like a terrible idea.
I think we have time for one more question. Who's left on stack? All right, so time for one more. All right.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure if this question will be really coherent, but it returns to the three types of mediation and the ways that they don't identify capitalism. I was just wondering, isn't like a prime way of identifying capitalism this move from the process of commodity, money, commodity towards this cyclic notion of money, commodity, money, where you get like basically self-valorization of money as like the basic form of capitalism, the basic thing with which you would identify capitalism with. And I'm not sure if any of these point toward that direction. Maybe the middle group, or maybe the last group that posits money as the mediating form.
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable point, and I think they both would. In fact, I think all three would want to, that you say, so we've got CMC, and then there's this shift to MCM prime, and that shift is how you get to a full-blown capitalist society, if you like. And so, but how do you get from how do you get from the C to M prime? Well, the C is not random commodities, the C is labor. That's what that commodity is. And so if you want to defend the labor side of things, you'll say C. That C in the middle of MCM prime, that's labor. And so that's how we know that labor does it. And then if you want to defend the commodity version of it, you'll say, well, yeah, in that instance it's labor, but more broadly speaking, it's commodities in general that you can also, the labor, like what's important is not the labor, it's that you're making something, you're employing somebody to make something that you are then going to sell, and it's that commodification that's important. And so that is part of their answer as well. And then for the monetarist approach, I wish they'd call it something else, because it's like I don't want to be reminded of Friedman every time I talk about Marx. But the monetarist approach would say M prime can only, M prime, the addition is only realized in exchange, which means that money is what is crucial there. So I think they would all say, we are identifying what is important in the transition from CMC to MCM prime. And then I guess I would want to say the same thing and say, no, you only get the prime if you've got labor, commodity, ... Like you've got to have all of them in order to make this comprehensible. That's a really great question. I should have thought of that. Thank you.